Well, there's something I know that's true about everyone in this room, and that is that you fall into at least one of these categories. You're a parent, you will be a parent someday, or you have parents. I think that does not leave anyone out. And there's something that tends to be true about parents. For the most part, parents love their children and want to keep them safe. And parents want their children's lives to be better than their own lives have been. And so we go to great lengths for this to happen. And also, there's no parent who wants to see their child disappointed or experience pain. But we know that it's not possible to prevent that. And when they're young, it's small things. And we say, well, this is just life. And we know that with guidance, these things can make them stronger. But sometimes, as a parent, you watch your child experience pain that's so severe, you don't know how he or she will survive, and you're not sure it will make them stronger. I have one of those stories. My oldest son's name is Jared. And if I were to paint a word picture for you of who Jared is, I would say that he lives in color, every color of the rainbow. And his baseline number on a scale of 1 to 10 when he's awake is 11. Now, a lot of you know my son Jason. Jason will tell you that when he's awake, his baseline is 5. And Jason is very steady and consistent, and he lives every day at a baseline of 5. Well, some of us have actually seen Jason at a 6. But as steady and consistent as Jason is, Jared's all the way on the other end of the scale. And he's just spontaneous and idealistic and creative. And from the time he could make a sound, Jared embraced life and all things were possible. When he was around 22 years old, in the space of less than 2 years, he experienced 3 tragic events. Each of them happened to a different person who was significantly important in his life. And Jared's world was just rocked and turned inside out. One day, he and I were in his apartment talking, and he said something in the conversation that is just forever etched in my mind. He said, "Mom, if God can't take care of the people you love, what does he do?" And he meant that question at an 11 with every fiber in his being. It's the kind of question that all of us at some point ask in some way. It can sound like, does God care? Or if God is good, how could this happen? Is God really who he says he is? And as we just try to grapple with the evil that's in the world around us, even though in our heads we know the right answer, in our hearts we wonder, does evil win? Sometimes those questions come when you feel disappointed because something you've hoped for and prayed for a long time that surely would be God's will for you just doesn't happen. Or a relationship that's supposed to be forever ends. And maybe you don't put those questions into words, but sometimes they're just under the surface. Or sometimes we wrestle with who God is when we grapple with things like genocide, or we hear stories of human trafficking, or when despite our best efforts, our finances or our health suffer. Or sometimes you come to a time in life where you just can't remember the last time that things were going well because life just seems mostly difficult. At those times, what do you do with the questions? Maybe some of you have never had those questions, though, or you've never felt the undoing effect of evil. But one day, you will be in a relationship with someone who's close to you, who asks the question, is God really who he says he is? And when that question comes, what will you do? Well, even Christ followers ask these questions, and there's nothing wrong with questions. They just are what they are. They're a way of putting words to what's happening inside of us. But one of Jesus' closest followers actually wrote down what Jesus said to prepare his followers for experiencing evil that would be so unthinkable, he knew it would cause them to question who he was. And just a little bit about John to get a feel for the passion that he wrote with. John was just a teenager when Jesus invited him to follow. And during his 3.5 years as a disciple, John totally opened his heart to Jesus. He accepted Jesus' correction and just soaked in his teaching. And more than any of the other disciples, John and Jesus shared this deep friendship and love. In fact, when Jesus was dying, he asked John to take care of his own mother. Well, toward the end of the first century, the young church began to struggle with who Jesus was. And so John wrote down his own account of Jesus' life, and it became the Gospel of John in our Bible today. And John said, there's so much more that I could have written than I have written, but I've written down the things that convinced me that he is who he said he is, because I believe those are the things that'll convince you. And so more than any of the other gospel writers, John wrote in detail about this last conversation that Jesus had with the disciples to prepare them for just the most horrible thing that would rock their worlds and turn them inside out. Well, let's turn in our Bibles to John 16. The conversation actually begins in chapter 13 and continues through a prayer that Jesus prays in John 17. But the part that we're going to focus on today is in John 16. Much of this conversation is review for the disciples as one last time Jesus thinks of all the things that he wants to use to prepare them for this experience they're about to go through on that very night. So Jesus tells them again that he's going to die and that he'll be raised from the dead. He says one of them is going to betray him and one is going to deny having ever known him. He talks to them about the Holy Spirit who will come to strengthen them and to teach them and comfort them. And then he says, I'm telling you these things so that you won't fall away, because he knows that they're about to go through something so horrible that it will cause them to question. Well, let's look at verse 30 in John 16, where toward the end of this conversation, the disciples say, from this, we believe that you came from God. Or in other words, they're saying, we believe that you are who you say you are. And then in verse 31, Jesus asks, do you finally believe? But the time is coming. In fact, it's already here when you'll be scattered, each one going his own way, leaving me alone. Yet I'm not alone, because the Father's with me. And then the last words that Jesus leaves them with, maybe it's even as if to say, if you forget everything else, just hold on to this. In verse 33 of John 16, he says, I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you'll have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Jesus is trying to assure them that in the midst of this horrible thing they're about to experience, that they could find peace in him. Well, a few hours later, the disciples watch as evil is unleashed on Jesus. And despite Jesus' best efforts to prepare them, the disciples become afraid for their lives and they desert Jesus and hide. John returns to the cross, though, and he's there with Jesus' mother. And John watches with his own eyes as Jesus experienced the weight of sin and evil. And not just your sin and my sin and the evil that we hear about in the world, but in order for sin to not be the end of the story and for evil not to win, Jesus took on himself the weight of all the evil that the world had ever known. He experienced the evil of genocide and the injustice of human trafficking and war and hunger and the sting of betrayal, the weight of evil from disease and senseless accidents and pride and loss and death, Jesus took on himself the weight of all that sin and evil ever had and ever would do, so that evil would not win and sin would not be the end of the story. And it broke his heart, and he died. Well, John left the cross, and he joined the other disciples in hiding. And even though Jesus had done his best to prepare them for this, they were shell-shocked. Imagine somehow going into that room right at that time and going up to Peter and saying, "Peter, I know a horrible thing just happened. How are you with Jesus right now?" Peter probably would have said something like, "I believed everything he said. I believed he was the Son of God, but I must have been wrong. He's dead." Well, James, what about you? "Look what just happened. I don't know how to trust right now." Thomas, "I knew it was all too good to be true. He's dead." Well, John, what about you? "He changed my life, and I loved him. I didn't think this would happen. It just feels like evil won." The disciples came face to face with evil, and they asked the kinds of questions that we ask when we come face to face with evil. But as you know, this wasn't the end of the story. 3 days later, just as he predicted, Jesus rose from the dead. And if you were to ask the disciples then how they felt about Jesus, they would have said something like, "We just saw Jesus die. He was dead, and we believed it was the end. But it wasn't. He rose from the dead just like he said he was. Jesus is who he said he is." Well, knowing someone who can predict their own death and resurrection and then pull it off would change any of us. But it's really important to understand what it was about that experience that changed the disciples, because it's the same thing that'll change us. And here's what it was. The cross taught them that Jesus was who he said he was. They had seen and heard and touched the Son of God. The story of the cross is so powerful that what happened to the disciples will happen to anyone who believes. And while we live in the tension of a broken world where trouble of every kind can come to us, it's not the end of the story, and Jesus' death on the cross guarantees that. In the times that I've questioned God, and especially in some of my recent experiences, something that helps me is making myself say this sentence: "When it feels like evil wins, remember the cross." Let's just say that together. When it feels like evil wins, remember the cross. And when you think about the cross, imagine Jesus saying to you, evil is not the end of the story. But as long as you live in a broken world, there will be trouble and trials of all kinds. You'll suffer and be frustrated and distressed, and at times it'll feel like evil wins. But don't lose heart. In the midst of those times, I will be with you and I'll give you peace. I am who I say I am. I have conquered evil and I've overcome the world. When it feels like evil wins, remember the cross. Well, everything Jesus did on that night before he died was intentional. And in addition to just some certain things that he wanted to say to his disciples, there was something that he wanted to impress on them in a way that rather than talking about it, he chose to demonstrate. John wrote it down in the beginning of that same conversation, chapter 13, and he said that Jesus took on himself the role of a servant. He says he got up from the table and took off his outer robe. He put a towel around his waist and poured water into a basin, and then began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel. And when he was done, he sat down and he said, "Do you understand what I was doing?" He said, "I've washed your feet, and I'm doing this as an example. And I want you to wash each other's feet. Do as I've done to you." And what Jesus knew, that in order for his disciples to effectively share this message of the cross with a broken world where people experienced sin and pain and suffering every day, they would need to take on themselves the role of a servant and love and serve like Jesus did. And foot washing would be the reminder. Well, here at Newday, we take Jesus' words seriously. And once a quarter, we actually wash each other's feet, just like Jesus said to do, because we need the reminder too. As followers of Jesus in a broken world, we need to take on the role of a servant and love and serve like Jesus did. Well, this experience wasn't comfortable for the disciples, and it's usually not comfortable for us either, but sometimes that's what it takes to be reminded. But if today it seems like it would just be like too weird and over the top for you to wash someone's feet or to participate in that, we invite you to just be an observer and listen to the music that's going to play. And because Newday is a caring place, someone may invite you to participate with them. And although we just encourage you to try it, it's okay to say not this time. Well, in just a moment, I'm going to pray before we do foot washing. After I pray, I just want to invite you to go out the center doors to pick up a basin and a towel, and then to come in through the side doors, and we'll do foot washing just right in here in this room. And when we're done, just return to your seats so that we can celebrate communion together.